This is Chapter 8, Obstetrical Complications. Our first topic is cervical insufficiency. And this is our case. A 32-year-old gravid 01 at 18 weeks gestation comes to the maternity unit complaining of pelvic pressure, increased vaginal mucus discharge. She denies any uterine contractions. Now, this is not a case that I made up. This is an actual case that happened to me. This patient who I saw called to the labor and delivery, and I was on duty. She said she's been having pelvic pressure and discharge and said no contractions. I said, why don't you come on in? So she came to labor and delivery, and on examination, what did I find? Membranes are bulging into the vagina. No cervix can be palpated. The cervix is completely effaced. Fetal feet can be felt through the membranes. 2 years ago, she underwent a cervical conization for cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. This was a tragic case. She lost the pregnancy, the baby died. The old term that we used for this was incompetent cervix. And the diagnosis was a historical one. Inability to retain the pregnancy to viability in the absence of contractions or labor. So basically, cervix dilates painlessly, without contractions, prior to viability, and she delivers a grossly immature baby that doesn't survive. Recent studies looking at sonographic cervical length, however, suggest that cervical function is not an all or none phenomenon, but may be a continuous variable with a range of degrees of competency that may be expressed differently in subsequent pregnancies. What this is trying to say is that it may be that in one pregnancy, the cervix is insufficient and loses it. Pregnancy is lost. But in the next pregnancy, it may very well go normally, which changes the whole definition. This is an example of a case where you can see the membranes bulging through the cervix, which is markedly effaced. And this is what you would see. Does this mean that this patient has an incompetent cervix? Here we have an ultrasound picture of a cervix. This is the internal os, this is the external os. And you can see if we measure the length, it's about 5 centimeters long. Now I'm going to show you what happens with cervical insufficiency and what we used to call cervical incompetence. I'm going to superimpose on this an effacement, a dilation. We call this a funneling of the cervix. What happens is the internal os starts dilating. The cervix becomes thinner. And notice now the functional cervical length is only 2 centimeters. This is what happens with an insufficient cervix. This is an actual case that I had, and you can see how the internal os is open. We have funneling of the cervix, and the cervix is getting shorter. Why does this happen? A number of possibilities. Trauma from a rapid, forceful cervical dilation associated with second trimester abortion, very strong contractions, or because of metal dilators. It could be a cervical laceration, which was not repaired from a previous delivery. Injury from a cervical cone because of cervical dysplasia, and that's a major concern with young women. Or less likely, a congenital weakness from DES exposure. The current diagnosis is based upon a history of 2 or more successive unexplained second trimester pregnancy losses, not just one. It is unclear whether a cerclage is helpful just because you find in one pregnancy a short cervix or funneling. And what may be helpful is to do serial evaluations of the cervix. Looking with ultrasound, is the cervix changing? If she's got the criteria, 2 successive cervical changes with losses of the pregnancy, then you do an elective cerclage, and that's probably the most successful. An emergency or urgent cerclage may be considered if you've got cervix which is changing and dilating and membranes bulging as I showed on that picture, but that's going to be less likely to be successful. We take out the cerclage at 36 to 37 weeks before she goes into labor and avulses the cervix. This is a McDonald cervical cerclage. You can see the suture goes in and out, and then is tied tightly